Hey, how's it going, vinyl community? It's been a long time, a few months now since I made a video. I haven't bought a ton of records recently. I mean, that's relative. That's a relative statement. I still buy a lot of records, but compared to what I used to, I'm not buying, lots and things like that. But I found some cool stuff, including on my vacation slash research work trip to Portugal recently. So I wanted to show some of that to you. But first, some local finds. So first I was going to show you what's playing in the background. I don't know if you can hear it or not. It's loud, but maybe too far away. This is a German-Spanish movie soundtrack. It's called Psychedelic Dance Party by the Vampyros Sound Incorporation, but it's actually the soundtrack to like an exploitation movie from the late 60s, early 70s called Vampyros Lesbos, which I saw a few years ago at the Austin Film Society with a friend of mine, and it was funny because I had seen Murnau's Nosferatu like 2 weeks before, and then I had seen Werner Herzog's Nosferatu a week and a half before. They did like kind of a showing of those within a few days of each other, and then they showed this as a part of another series a few weeks later, and this is essentially Nosferatu, but instead of like in the Murnau version, every time he just pans to like creepy night sky with a bat flying, they have lesbians have some sex. That's essentially what they did. They took the exact same story and they just said, let's get rid of the creepy scenery and put sex with lesbians. And I gotta say, it was a really fun movie to watch just for how absurd it was. And the story is great. I could watch Nosferatu, either the Murnau or the Herzog version over and over and over again. So yeah, that's a recent reissue on a Spanish label. Originals of that record are like $1,000. It was like a super rare record, but on Mercury of all things. It's on a major label. Here's what I was pretty excited to get. This was an eBay buy. This was like somebody posted this with just the title, and they just said, "Great condition for the record, sleeves beat up," something like that. They just had no photos, nothing, no indication of what version it was. But it turned out to be either a first or second press. Sorry for the glare. This is Paul Chambers' Sextet, The Whims of Chambers. This has Donald Byrd and Coltrane, like name a big hard bop player from the era, and they are on this record. The sleeve is pretty nasty, actually. It's got tape on both top and bottom. But then the record itself is somewhere between VG and VG Plus, and it's got the original labels, the Lexington, with all of the the correct markings, but it's not a flat edge. So I think a very, very first pressing of this record should have been flat edge, and this one is not. So I think it must be a second press. Okay. I don't know why I put the record so far away from me, so I have to leave the frame. Sorry about that. Okay, now back onto the stuff I got while I was in Portugal. And I didn't get a ton because Portugal kind of like hypnotizes you because it's so cheap for things like food and wine and beer. Like, really cheap. But then the records weren't that cheap. So I would go into the record shops, like having been primed to expect everything to be much cheaper than in the US, and the records would be essentially what you would pay for these if you were lucky enough to stumble upon them in a US shop. That's, of course, the rub, that you're not going to find these in US shops. The first one I got, this is probably the rarest one I found the entire time. I found this in Porto at a record store called Porto Calling. That was a really nice record store. And I talked to the guy for quite a while in there. This is a Mozambique band called Os Magnificos, and it's just 2 tracks, a Timoda song, the first song's Timoda on the A side. That one's kind of what you'd expect. And then the second side is called Laura, and it is like Brit invasion, like pop rock with like kind of not distorted but out of tune maybe, jingly guitars. It's really that song is great. I won't put that in there right now. So that was worth it just to get that, and I found one person who had like put an MP3 of that online at like 4 or 5 years ago. It wasn't on Discogs or anything, so I created an entry for Discogs, but of course there's no way of really knowing what that record was worth, and I was happy to get it once I listened to it. The guy just let me throw stuff on the in-store system, so I just sat there playing through about 10, 15, 7 inches, just listening to this African music from Angola and Mozambique. I was hoping to get a lot of Brazilian stuff in Portugal, and I actually didn't find much of the really cool stuff, a lot of the 80s stuff, which you can actually get here sometimes. But I did get a couple comps and like other like 60s garage rock records. So this one is a compilation, As 14 Mais. I have no idea what that means, but it's got a cool kind of, somewhat trippy cover. And it's got a couple bands that sort of pop up over and over again. Roberto Carlos is popping up all over the place in this like garage rock. It's before the Tropicalia movement and everything like that. And then Renato is Suisse Blue Caps, which I'd love that they put English and then Portuguese, English, which I also got a full-length record by Renato and his Blue Caps. And this one I think has some originals, but the originals sound like covers, and then it has a bunch of Beatles covers. So I don't think they were necessarily trying hard to push a lot of original music for these records. These were probably like, how the Beatles' first records had a bunch of covers of old R&B. That was what was going on with these. And this is 1965, this record. And so then I got a number of records from Cape Verde, which was one of the Portuguese colonies. And it was actually a lot easier to find Cape Verde than like Angola or Mozambique records, and my guess is it's just more people came from there. And I like that kind of music quite a bit. I got quite a bit of it, but it's not my first go-to. And the reason is that it's often a little too clean sounding. It's a little too like I don't know what they're saying. They could be singing about the deepest blues that you can imagine, but they don't often really convey that with their vocal style. And I don't know why that is, but this record certainly does. So this record, you get a feel of like soul or R&B, like some kind of, really rough. You can feel what they're singing about. And of course, this stuff was all being made. This is Salale, Vum Vum. This stuff, of course, was all being made around the time that the Portuguese colonies were pushing out the Portuguese. So this would be like 74, 75. So like that Os Magnificos 7-inch was 74. I think this record, if I remember correctly... Oh, no, this doesn't actually say, but the guy at the record store told me. He could have been saying whatever, He said this was 75, but there's no indication, so I had to believe him. So around 74, 75, all these African colonies, Mozambique, Angola, and Cape Verde, are pushing the Portuguese out. At that time, the music is, reflecting that. So I know that a lot of this music I'm getting from there is protest music. I just don't know what the protest is. This one, you can hear that there's protests going on in the way that they sing it. Some of the other ones you really can't. I can't, at least. What's interesting then, of course, is that many, many people from those countries then moved to Lisbon. So a lot of these records are actually recorded and made in Portugal. So it's an African record. I don't know if you can see that. It's Fabricado em Portugal. So it was made in Portugal, even though it's protest music, from what I can tell. So yeah, that was my stuff from Portugal. I also went to Edinburgh, Scotland, and I don't know if I was just in the wrong areas or what, but I did not find anything good there. And the records were really beat up. I was really surprised. I was expecting like in Edinburgh, like I was hoping I'd be able to find, like some early Bell and Sebastian 7 inches, like this indie rock stuff, or like some Orange Juice stuff from the 80s. I didn't find anything. So I was pretty bummed in Edinburgh. But then Portugal really came through. I only spent a week in the areas of Lisbon and Porto, but I went to like 5 record shops, and I went to this flea market called Feira de Ladra, I think it's Feira de Ladra, which is like the thieves market, and it was kind of dirty, kind of just sprawling out on the street, but there were a couple of stands that were selling really cool records. And if anybody goes to Portugal, first I recommend it completely. I thought Portugal was an amazing place to visit. It was beautiful. They really have a great arts scene, so they must pay artists to put murals up on buildings. The music was really great. We went to see 2 live shows while we were there, or 3 live shows there, just on a whim. We went to a fado show, which is their traditional music. If you read about fado and you've never heard it, like I kept reading people compare it to the blues. I wouldn't compare it to the blues in terms of the sound. I would compare it more to like penny opera kind of things. Like it's very melodramatic, and it's beautiful. It has a kind of Spanish guitar behind it often. I mean, it's of course Portuguese guitar, but those of us in the U.S. would recognize it as a Spanish style guitar. But that was cool. And then one night we went to an African club, and we saw a guy play whose name is escaping me all of a sudden. I will post it on the comments because he's still recording music. It was actually his CD release show, and that was awesome. And then the next night in our Airbnb in this like square in the middle of Lisbon, they had a festival going on, and there they essentially had the Portuguese equivalent of Coldplay playing. Like, I don't know if they're as big in Portugal as Coldplay would have been at one time in the UK and the US, but they sounded like they took Coldplay and did it in Portuguese. And that one we were just sitting there eating dinner, and we just walked over and listened to it for a little while. So like lots of cool music. The museums were beautiful, and again, it's really really cheap, especially right now with the dollar being relatively strong against the euro. And that's actually why I got some records I maybe wouldn't have 3 or 4 years ago when it was the opposite. Okay, well, hope you guys found those records interesting. I say definitely check out that movie and that soundtrack to Vampyros Lesbos, unless you don't like nudity and vampires biting one another. But if you like that kind of stuff, or if you're not bothered by it, it's a really fun movie. The soundtrack is killer. And then, definitely, I'm going to post a link to a guy's blog. He doesn't seem to do it anymore, but there is like a community of Portuguese colony music collectors from what I've seen. And the music is really, really interesting to explore. And I wish I could have found some like stack of beat up 7 inches for cheap and just brought them all back and listened to them. But they were all running like 20 euros, so I wasn't going to buy a ton of them. But it was really cool, and it was really fun to just go in those record stores and just throw stuff on right and left and see what it sounded like. Okay, well, I'll see you guys sometime soon, and follow my Instagram if you don't, because I post quite a bit on there, and I'll pick up again now that I'm back home from all this travel. Okay, see you guys.